Hello everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to another stream. My brother introduced this channel to me, Tasting History. Guys, you can guess, it's about food history. And given recent events, I thought this one would be a I thought this particular one would be a good something to start with, I'd say. You get no ad time here, go away. Skip.
Polls, we get a little sticker that says, I voted. And that's great. But you know what would be even better? Cake. And that is exactly what you got when you went to vote in colonial New England. So thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video as I do my civic duty by baking some election cake. This time on Tasting History.
Election cake? You got some cake for voting?
So I don't often revisit a dish here on the channel, but back when I first started the channel, back in 2020, I actually made an election cake from 1896, and I talked a little bit about the history, but it was in a Q&A live stream, and I thought that it was worth giving a dedicated episode to this food. But this time, I'm going back an entire century to 1796. The recipe is perhaps the first published recipe for election cake, and it makes a cake that is absolutely massive. It's from American Cookery by Amelia Simmons, and it calls for 30 quarts flour, 10 pounds butter, 14 pounds sugar.
What the hell? That is a massive ass cake. Are you trying to feed an entire army with that cake? Wait, that's not the whole thing yet, is it?
12 pounds raisins, 3 dozen eggs, 1 pint wine, 1 quart brandy, 4 ounces cinnamon.
Hang on, that's like 10, 24, 36 pounds already.
4 ounces fine colander seed, 3 ounces ground allspice. Wet the flour with the milk to the consistency of bread overnight, adding 1 quart yeast. The next morning, work the butter and sugar together for half an hour, which will render the cake much lighter and whiter. When it has risen light, work in every other ingredient except the plums, which work in when going into the oven. Like I said, absolutely massive cake. I'm going to be cutting this to 1/30th of the original recipe, and it's still going to make a very, very large cake, but I'm not making enough for an entire town to have an election. Besides the size of the cake, what's interesting is the way that it is leavened. It is a yeast-leavened cake. This recipe comes from just before they started using baking soda. But even then, it's not the usual way that a yeast-leavened cake is made, at least the ones that I've made. You're making bread dough and using that to mix in with the batter to leaven the cake. Like I said, I've never made anything like this, and I kind of think it might not work. Could end up being a disaster, but we're in this together. So for this recipe, what you'll need is 4 cups or 500 grams of flour, 1.5 cups or 350 milliliters of milk, 2 tablespoons or 18 grams of active dry yeast, and a half cup or 120 milliliters of flat beer. The beer is because at the time it would have been ale barm that they used for the yeast, so this should approximate the flavor a little bit more than water, but you can also just use water. So stir the yeast into the beer and let it sit for about 10 minutes until it becomes nice and foamy. And while it sits, you can mix the flour and milk together in a large bowl, and you should get a very, very dry dough. Once it's mixed, add the yeast mixture and mix it into the dough. If it's too wet to come together, add a couple spoonfuls of flour, but just enough so that it comes together to form a rough dough, and then cover it up and let it rise. Now it says to let it rise overnight, but this cake would have been made in New England in late April or early May. We'll get to why that is later. But so it would be pretty chilly at night. I looked at the temperatures from the late 18th century, and you're going to want to put this into the refrigerator overnight. If you don't want to put it in the refrigerator, it only needs about 2 hours to rise. The next morning you can take it out of the fridge, uncover it, let it return to room temperature, and while you do that, you can gather the rest of your ingredients, which are a heaping cup or 180 grams of raisins, 1.5 sticks or 170 grams of butter, 1 1/8 cup or 225 grams of sugar, 2 eggs, a quarter cup or 60 milliliters of brandy, 2 tablespoons or 30 milliliters of a sweet wine, 1 tablespoon of cinnamon, 1 tablespoon coriander, and 2 teaspoons of allspice. First, you want to plump your raisins by soaking them in some cool water for about 20 minutes, during which time you can add your butter and your sugar to a bowl and beat until they are nice and fluffy. The more you beat them, the better. Then add the eggs and beat until they're just incorporated, and then add the brandy and wine and mix, and then add all of your spices and stir until everything is mixed throughout. Then take this batter and mix it in with the risen bread dough. And let me tell you, it is not easy to mix these two substances. They do not want to come together. But if you just keep at it, eventually they sort of will. Once you have finished mixing, or once you get bored of mixing, cover it up and let it rise for another 30 to 40 minutes. While you prepare a large cake pan, I am using a 10-inch round pan, but you can use 2 smaller pans or several loaf pans. You're going to butter the bottom and sides and line it with parchment. Then drain your raisins and toss them in some flour. This will make it so they don't sink to the bottom of the cake. And it's funny in the recipe because in the list of ingredients she calls them raisins, but then at the end she calls them plums. So she goes back and forth. And if you didn't know that raisins were called plums at that time, you'd be mighty confused. Luckily I do know that, but otherwise you'd be like, where'd the plums come from? Also, it makes me wonder, should I do a video on sugar plums? Because they are neither raisins nor plums, but maybe around Christmas I could do sugar plums. They're a lot of work. Maybe I'll do that. Anyway, once the raisins are floured, incorporate them into your risen cake batter and pour it into the cake pan about 2/3 full. Level it and set it in the oven at 375 Fahrenheit or 190 Celsius and bake for about 45 minutes or until it is baked through. Again, when I started this process, I really did not think that it was going to work, but just a few minutes in the oven and the yeasted cake was beginning to rise. One might say it is an election day miracle, which raises the question, why on earth were people eating these massive cakes on election day?
My mantra is that every next level demands a different you, and
Going. Right, time for the
Election
history
cake
portion.
started out as a decidedly New England food, mostly in Connecticut and Massachusetts. And it was baked not in November, when we hold most of our elections today here in the US, but sometime between late April and early June, because that's when they held their elections, because they weren't presidential elections. In Connecticut, Election Day was meant to elect the colony's governor, a privilege most colonies didn't have at all. Typically, the governor was appointed by the king, but in Connecticut and at different times Rhode Island and Massachusetts, they had the right to elect their own governor, and they took that right very seriously. Election Day was a very important day. It was one of the few days throughout the year where everybody in the colony, at least all of the men, came together into one central location in the capital. But it wasn't just to vote, but also to visit friends and family and to listen to a very long sermon. It was one of the most important sermons of the year because not only was it delivered to a large audience, but often to the governor as well. And so the preacher took advantage of the captive audience. Some of the most important speeches of 17th century New England came in the form of these election day sermons. And when I say that they were long, I mean they could go on for hours. We have some of them because they would publish them afterwards, and sometimes they were between 15 and 20,000 words.
Say
it's like a
what
novella.
now?
And so I'm sure that it worked up an appetite for both the orator and the audience, but luckily afterward there was a lot of cake to be had. Now, exactly when these election cakes began to be made is not known, but the location that became most associated with them was Hartford, Connecticut. And Connecticut, just like Massachusetts, was a Puritan colony, and so they were sorely lacking in holidays. They didn't really do Christmas and Easter and Whitsun and all of those. They would just go to church. It was another day for church. But a holiday, not so much. And then there were holidays like May Day, where in England and much of Europe people really celebrated, but they not only didn't celebrate those, they actually outlawed them. But even Puritans need some sort of frivolity, and so the big holiday of the year became Election Day. Election Day, the reddest lettered in our calendar, brightened the whole year. Good housekeepers were expected to have finished their spring cleaning long before, and fire irons and brasses were papered and put away in the garret. Do these guys know how to party or what? Yeah, it's a different time. But one thing that marked the occasion, other than spring cleaning, was the preparation of election cake. The cake making began a week beforehand, this delectable compound testing the talents and strengths of a cook as nothing else could possibly do. And a Hartford family that cannot recite some tradition connected with it has no claims to antiquity. Mothers sat up all night to watch the batch of 12 or 20 loaves, or called their daughters long before cock-crowing to make investigations. Nay, some were known to faint from fatigue while mixing the materials. In Hartford, Election Day landed on the second Thursday in May, and it wasn't just a day, but an entire week of festivities. There were, of course, the elections, though sometimes actually the elections took place well before, and this was more the installing of whoever got elected. But regardless, there was the political aspect, but then there were days of going around and seeing friends and family that you hadn't seen.
Hello there, Diggs. Welcome to the stream. How's it going? What's up to you? Today we're watching food history videos. This one is about election cake from 1796. I thought it was somewhat appropriate given recent events. Recent unfortunate events.
All year. And when you went to someone's house, they would give you a slice of their election cake. Though there was also usually a really massive election cake given to everyone by the town, and it's kept in the town center during a big old party. In the public records of the colony of Connecticut, it shows that the local council paid for a huge celebration for everyone on Election Day in 1771. They paid for people to have tobacco and barrels of alcoholic cider and porterage, as well as the ingredients for what would have been an absolutely massive election cake. The bill came from an Ezekiel Williams Esquire and charged £2 7 shillings 9 pence for the raisins, cloves, mace, sugar, etc. for the cake, then another 5 shillings 10 pence for the flour, and £2 5 pence to a Mrs. Ledley for doing the baking. So it was about £5 to make this cake.
99% of people eat Cheetos.
Go away. Go. You get no ad time here. Feck off.
Like $1,500, give or take, right now. So that was really expensive.
Unfortunately, I do not have
Now,
YouTube
even
Premium.
after the colonial period, in Hartford, Election Day still was like the major holiday of the year. As late as 1809, there was a traveler who went to Hartford who wrote about the festivities. On the evening following that of the election day, there is an annual ball at Hartford called the Election Ball, and on the succeeding Monday, a second, which is more select. The election day is a holiday throughout the state, and even the whole remainder of the week is regarded in a similar light. Servants and others are now in some measure indemnified for the loss of the festivals of Christmas, Easter, and Whitsuntide, which the principles of their church deny them. Families exchange visits and treat their guests with slices of election cake, and thus preserve some portion of the luxuries of the forgotten feast of the Epiphany. I like that he points out that all of the other holidays that servants would have off in the rest of the new United States did not really apply in Connecticut. In Connecticut, you're working Christmas. Now, while election cake might have started out as a Hartford tradition, it did not stay that way, and that is in part due to the cookbook that we are cooking from today. See, American Cookery was first published in Hartford, Connecticut, and later in New York, but the book was a hit far beyond New England and helped to spread New England dishes to other parts of the U.S. Foods like pumpkin pie, turkey, and cranberries, and it also spread a recipe for something that the Dutch families of the area called a cookie. Those foods obviously had a little bit more staying power, seeing as we still eat them today. I love a cookie. But election cake did make the rounds for a while, and by the mid-19th century, there were recipes showing up all the way in California and Oregon. Though even as the cake spread, the importance of it really kind of remained a Hartford thing. But even there, that was not to last. In 1867, the Hartford Courant printed an article where a Hartford lady reminisced on the cake's importance in earlier decades. Will somebody who remembers it all tell about election in old times in Hartford? Oh, the quantities of cake! A batch of election cake was 12 loaves, but there had to be more than one batch, and plenty of sponge cake with it. You didn't wear your white frock, but your new calico, best bonnet, and red shoes. And you went down street to see the governor come into town. The streets were crowded, the bells rang, lots of money to spend. Children could have a cent any time they asked for it, election day. And cake, a big piece, not a slice, every time they ran into the house. Nobody dared refuse them. It stands ready all day for wagons full of country friends and acquaintances come to see the parade. All must eat loaf cake and tell what luck they had with theirs. If you go to the neighbors, you must eat a piece, of course. The cake didn't really disappear, but it was no longer part of an event. And even though recipes appear throughout the 19th and into the early 20th century, all of the events surrounding it were forgotten and never known to most of the people eating them. The story of election cake would appear here and there in newspapers around the country throughout the 20th century, but for the most part, yeasted cake was just not really something that appealed to people anymore, and so it was more of a novelty relegated to the page and not to the actual kitchen. That is, until now.
Until now.
Shockingly, my 18th century election cake actually has risen and should be about ready to eat. So once it's baked, let your cake cool to room temperature before slicing. And here we are, Hartford election cake from 1796. I gotta say, I thought that this thing was gonna be dry, but the moment I sliced into it, it's still really moist and held together and rose. It's not too dense, or at least it doesn't look too dense. Call me flabbergasted, though. Let's taste it. That is really moist. Like, that was surprisingly good. And the flavors keep developing. I feel like this is going to be one of those things where actually it tastes better tomorrow than it does today, or even in 2 days. Because all of the spices, they're going to really permeate the cake and kind of come together a little bit more.
And he had his doubts.
Shockingly good. I have to say, I did not expect to like this. Did not think that I would recommend it, but I am recommending it. The other one that I made a few years ago, it used like chemical leavener, so I thought that that would be, this is better. This is really, really good. You should make it if you got some time. I mean, it takes some time, but really quite nice. And so I'll put the recipe for that, as always, up on my website. You can also sign up for the Tasting History newsletter over on my website, tastinghistory.com, which I made with a bit of help from today's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace makes it easy to create a beautiful and user-friendly website.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, so that was election cake from 1796. That's unfortunate, we don't have election cakes today. We just have depression. No matter which side you're on. Decisions. You want 2,000-year-old Roman cheesecake or medieval breakfast? Beef tea? Viking funeral bread? Emergency steak? Cornflakes from 1895? 1940s deep dish pizza? Mock apple pie? What's his most popular video? A medieval tavern meal. Medieval mead. Pork and beans. Civil War rations. Dining third class on the Titanic. Oh, history of pizza. You have my attention. Nope, nope. You go away. You go away. You get no hat time. Oh, come on.
What's the Pope's favorite pizza topping? I actually don't know. But in 1570, it might have been rosewater and sugar. And that's what we're making today. A 16th century Italian pizza served in the papal court, which calls for exactly those ingredients. So thank you to Bright Cellars for sponsoring this video as we slice into the history of pizza, this time on Tasting History. So this recipe comes from the Opera di Bartolomeo Scappi, which I did an entire episode on, and I'll put a link up here in the corner so you can watch it, or I'll put one in the description as well. The entire book is filled with recipes that are quintessentially Italian Renaissance, that kind of mixture of sweet and spice that our palate might just be like, what? And this one is no different. Per fare pizza sfogliata ad un altro modo. Another way to prepare flaky pizza. Bring together 3 pounds of fine flour and 2 ounces of yeast starter, 4 ounces of breadcrumb that is soaked in warm water, and enough salt. When the dough is made, let it rest, covered in a warm place to rise, as is done with bread. Then knead it again on the table for a half hour, adding in little by little 2 pounds of fresh butter. Knead until all of the butter has been worked into the dough and it has become soft. Split the dough up into 2 or 3 pieces, and with each piece, make the pizza in a torte pan which has fresh butter in it. Bake it in an oven with melted butter on top. Make several holes on top with the tip of a knife so it will not puff up too much. When it is nearly done, sprinkle with sugar and rose water. This pastry should be baked slowly and serve it hot.
Water?
So does that sound at all like a pizza to you? No, not really. But frankly, the definition of pizza is kind of weird. I mean, look at Chicago-style pizza. It's basically soup. Anyway, for this recipe, what you'll need is 4 cups or 480 grams of bread flour, a 1/4 cup or 60 grams of high yeast biga. This will need to have a much higher yeast and flour content than your typical sourdough starter, so it might take you a little while to make that or just add in more yeast. If you just want to use dried yeast, I'd use about a teaspoon. 6 tablespoons or 60 grams of breadcrumbs soaked in 1 cup or 120 milliliters of warm water. An additional 1/2 cup of water. 2 teaspoons of salt. 1 pound or 400 grams of unsalted butter cut into pieces. So usually during Scappi's time, butter would have a lot of salt in it, more than we'd be used to, but he specifically in this recipe calls for fresh butter. So my thought is that he's not adding the salt because the salt was added as a preservative. I don't know that, but he also calls out salt individually in the recipe, so we're doing unsalted butter and just adding salt where we need. 2 tablespoons of melted butter, 1 tablespoon of sugar, and 1 teaspoon of rose water. Now you'll notice that these are not the exact quantities that Scappi called for because he must be making a pizza to feed, well, the entire papal court, which he probably was. I cut everything in half, and it's still a lot of dough. So first, whisk the salt into the flour, then add your yeast and soaked breadcrumbs, and then mix everything together. Then add in the additional 1/2 cup of water, but only as much as you need to make it form a dough. This dough ends up being super sticky once you add in all of the butter, so don't add any more water than you need to get it to come together. If you need to add more later on, you can, but it's gonna be real sticky. Then knead the dough for about 10 minutes until the dough starts to smooth out. Then put it in a lightly greased bowl and cover, allowing it to double in size. Now depending on the yeast, it could take 2 to 4 hours to rise. Mine took about 4, but it was so worth the wait. Plus, it gave me time to pour myself a glass of wine, courtesy of today's sponsor, Bright Cellars. Now, if you've ever watched this show before, you will know that occasionally I do enjoy a glass of wine, and one of my favorite things about wine is trying new wines. But whenever I go to the store, I always end up getting the same wines that I know because I already know that I'm going to like them. So, the cure to my wine monotony I found is Bright Cellars. You take a 7-question quiz on what you enjoy, and then they send you a lose. I told them what I like, and they sent me a wonderful selection of full-bodied, juicy red wine, so that's why he went with it. But I like a Syrah. Que Syrah, Syrah. Whatever would be, you know. Oh, that's nice. It's got a lot of fruit in it. Those plums, those blackberries, it's everything I like. The quiz worked. Also, don't give your box the wine comes in. 4-bottle box. Just click the link in the description. Now, back to your regularly scheduled pizza. Once the dough is risen, punch it down and turn it out onto a lightly floured surface. Stretch it into a square or rectangle and scatter a few pieces of butter on top, then fold it over to cover the butter. Then knead it until the butter is fully incorporated. Then do this again, and again, and again, until all of the butter is incorporated. Pro tip, use a stand mixer if you got it. Also, as you add butter into this dough, it is going to get super sticky. And if it becomes too sticky to work with, which it probably will at some point, just add some more flour. 1 or 2 tablespoons at a time, just to keep it, you know, in dough form rather than like liquid butter form.
Fattening.
Once all the butter is incorporated and the dough is silky smooth, divide it into 3 pieces, then let it rest, preferably in the refrigerator, for about a half an hour. And while you wait, preheat your oven to 350 Fahrenheit or 175 Celsius. Then butter the bottom and the sides of a large pie or cake pan. It's going to work best if you have one of those false bottom cake pans. It's just easier to get out, but you don't need it. What you do want to use is the biggest frickin' pan that you can find, because even halved, which is what I'm doing, this recipe calls for a lot of dough. You can also half what I'm doing, which is a quarter of what Scappi's doing, because, I mean, if you don't have a 10-inch cake pan, which is what I used, half it. Once the dough is rested, roll it into discs the diameter of the pan, and form the pizza by layering the dough pieces in the pan on top of each other. Then top it all off by brushing on a layer of melted butter. Then, using a knife, poke some holes all over the top to keep it from puffing up too much. Then set the pizza on a lined baking sheet and bake for an hour and 15 minutes. Now that is a long bake time, but it's because it's a lot of frickin' dough. But that gives me time to top off my glass of wine and tell you how we got from this pizza to this pizza.
No ad time here, go away.
So when tracking the history of pizza, we really have to figure out where to start, because if your idea of pizza is just some flatbread with stuff on it, then the ancient Greeks, Egyptians, and Indians had pizza. But I don't consider naan with some oil on it pizza. In the 6th century BC, Persian soldiers under Darius the Great baked flatbread on their shields and put cheese and dates on top. Closer, but pizza? I mean, they didn't call it pizza, and frankly, if you're going to call that pizza, then you have to call pancakes that have syrup and berries on it pizza, and then where do you draw the line? Is tostada a pizza?
No, I don't think so.
Well, then when does pizza become a thing? Well, the very first mention of pizza using the word pizza comes from 997 in Gaeta, Italy. It was found in a contract between Bernardo, the son of Duke Marino II, and the Bishop of Gaeta. And basically, if Bernardo wanted to use the bishop's mill, then every year on Christmas Day, you and your heirs must pay us 12 pizze, 12 pizzas. And similarly, 12 pizzas and a couple of chickens on the day of Holy Easter of Resurrection. So even before our papal pizza today, bishops were eating it. Very popular dish amongst the clergy. Now, the first recipe for something called pizza comes from 1524 in the Manoscritto Lucano. And then, some years later, in 1570, we have 5 pizza recipes in Bartolomeo Scapi's opera, which we are making one of today. Scapi is also the first mention of that link between Naples and pizza. To prepare a torte with various ingredients called pizza by Neapolitans. Though some of the ingredients include pine nuts, dates, figs, raisins, and cinnamon, none of which are available at Domino's. Maybe at Papa John's, though. Now, that connection between Naples and pizza is very important because Naples is often credited with being the birthplace of what we know as pizza today. But it was not papal pizza like we are making today. It is poor people pizza. It was a food for the poor, or the lazzarone, as Alexandre Dumas said. And he didn't seem to hold them in high regard. But the pizza that they were eating sounds a lot more like what we would know as pizza today. The Lazzarona usually eats 2 things, pizza and watermelon. Pizza is round in shape and is kneaded from the same dough as bread. It comes in different widths depending on the price. A 2-farthing pizza is enough for a man, a 2 pennies should fill a whole family. The pizza is with oil, the pizza is with bacon, the pizza is with lard, the pizza is with cheese, the pizza is with tomatoes, the pizza is with small fish. The word pizza has lost all meaning at this point in the video. Now, he mentions cheese and tomatoes, and those, I would think, are pretty important to pizza today. And for more on the amazing history of tomatoes specifically, you should watch this video up here, I'll put it in the description, on the history of tomatoes, aka the badass name Wolf Peach. It's a really good video.
Wolf
Now, the
Peach,
Lazzarone
what?
mostly ate these pizzas on weekdays as they saved up their money so they could buy macaroni on Sundays, though macaroni did not necessarily look like macaroni as we think of it. And if you still had trouble saving up enough, then you could get a discount pizza if you were fine with day-old pizza, which I usually am. Dumas even says, there are week-old pizzas for those with small purses. These can, if not pleasantly, at least advantageously replace seafood biscuits. Week-old pizza? Before refrigerators?
The cheese is old and moldy.
I'm guessing it was one of these pizzas that prompted Samuel Morse, the inventor of the telegraph, to describe pizza as a species of most nauseating cake covered over with slices of pomodoro or tomatoes and sprinkled with little fish and black pepper and I know not what other ingredients. It altogether looks like a piece of bread that had been taken reeking out of the sewer. That was probably just a piece of Chicago-style deep dish. Ooh, fighting words. Now, in general, the pizza was not
This
looked
guy
on
doesn't
with
like
high
Chicago
regard, and
style.
Dumas even says, "You can't eat a pizza without risking suffocation." Was Dumas a drama queen or severely gluten intolerant? You decide. Though I do wonder if Dumas actually mixed up this week-old pizza with pizza a otto, which was basically you got fresh pizza today, but you had to pay for it 8 days later, like layaway or the payday lenders of 19th century Naples.
Well, I went to college right out of high school.
Nope, no ad time here. Go away. Back off.
To be small, kind of personal-sized pizzas that were sold on the streets by street vendors, though there were some more reputable locations where you could eat pizza, including a tavern that was founded in the 18th century called Pizzeria di Pietro e Basta Così, which translates roughly to the most stereotypically Italian-sounding name ever. Peter's Pizza Place, and that's enough. How great is that? And it is in this shop, later renamed Pizzeria Brandi, where we get pizza's most famous origin story. It's probably, well, it's definitely not completely true. It's probably somewhat true, but here it is. In 1889, Umberto I, king of a recently unified Italy, and his wife, Queen Margherita, decided to branch out from the French cuisine of the palace and headed to Naples, where they commissioned Raffaele Esposito, the then owner of Pizzeria Brandi, to make 3 pizzas. One with lard, one with fish, and one with basil, tomato, and fresh mozzarella. Queen Margherita tried the first pizza and said, "This pizza is too fatty." She tried the second pizza and said, "This pizza is too fishy." Finally, she tried the third pizza, the one with mozzarella, tomato, and basil, and she said, "This pizza is just right." And thus was born the Pizza Margherita. It even had the 3 colori, or colors, of the Italian flag: green basil, white mozzarella, and red tomatoes. Again, probably not entirely true. Well, it's definitely not entirely true, but there might be some truth to it. But Naples says that this is how it happened, and the story is just too good not to accept without question. But even with the Queen on board, pizza still stayed a food of the poor, and thank God it did, because those were the people who brought it to America. In the late 19th and early 20th century, poor Italian immigrants brought pizza to the streets of New York City. Now, pizza was being sold all over the streets of New York, especially in Little Italy, but the first place that is credited with the first pizza, because they went and got a license, that's why, is called Lombardi's on Spring and Mott Street in Little Italy, and that is just 1 block from my first New York apartment. It was so small, great area, but it was so small that my bedroom door could not open all the way because I had a twin bed in there, and that got in the way. So, could you really call it a bedroom if it can't fit a bed? But pizza still really hadn't taken off outside of the Italian-American community. For that, we would have to go to war. When our brave boys returned home from fighting in Italy in WW2, they brought back a love of Italian food. And one of those Italian foods was pizza. It was the perfect food for the new suburban lifestyle. It could be made at home, or it could be made for delivery, and pizza places started popping up in cities all over the country. In 1958, Pizza Hut opened. Pizza the Hut! And in 1960, Tom and James Monahan bought the Michigan pizzeria Dominic's and changed the name to Domino's. This is also when frozen pizza was becoming popular, and I do love a frozen pizza. To this day, I cannot do Halloween. Halloween has to start with a Red Baron pizza. I do not know why, but every Halloween I eat myself an entire Red Baron pizza all by myself, just as I did when I was a little kid. I was a chubby kid. I was a big kid. I wore husky pants, but man, I do love a Red Baron pizza. I only do it once a year now, though. What's interesting is that back in Old Italy, pizza still hadn't really gotten out of Naples and a few other places like Sicily. But when American tourists started showing up in Italy and they wanted pizza and Pisa, the other parts of Italy had to step up and start making their own kinds of pizza. And it didn't go great at first. Some of the country was so bad at mimicking Neapolitan pizza that the city of Naples founded AVPN, or the Associazione Verace Pizza Napoletana, which laid the groundwork for what makes pizza pizza. But I think that it was a little too late. The cat was already out of the bag because here in America, we were making sushi pizza and pizza bagels, and we had really done whatever we want with pizza. Heck, you could even come over to my house later tonight and have yourself a pizza with rose water and sugar because I'm pretty sure my pizza's about done. So at 1 hour and 15 minutes, open up the oven and quickly brush on the rose water and sprinkle with sugar. Then let it bake for another 15 minutes or until it's baked all the way through. And then your papal pizza is ready to eat. And here we are, Scappi's pizza from the Italian Renaissance. Now this is a real pizza work. So, it's...
I do not define that
amazing.
as a pizza.
And it smells like fresh... It kind of smells like croissants. I let it cool. You need to let it cool before you cut into it because the butter needs so much butter. Here we go. Let's give this a taste. I don't think it... Maybe it overrose or... I'm not sure. It's gonna be fine.
That is not a pizza. That's like a cake at this point, or a really thick loaf of bread.
That's delicious. It's not pizza.
I told you so.
I mean, that's fantastic. The rose is so subtle. I'm gonna just taste some of the top. The rose is so subtle. It's there on the top. That's wonderful. Wow. I would make it thinner next time. I'd do like a half of my recipe. I really think that that's probably the way to go. This is nice, but oh my God, it's so much bread. You know, we're not gonna eat this. But, is it pizza?
No.
I mean, it's called pizza, but I think it would be like if somebody said, hey, are you a doctor? And I said, yes, I'm a doctor. And then they found out I'm a doctor of, you know, like the oboe performance or something like that. I mean, yeah, I'm a doctor, but I'm not a doctor. By the way, I'm not a doctor of anything, so that's just a story. But this is some really good pizza. Just, you know, don't tell your friends that it's pizza, they'll think you're crazy. Instead, tell them this is pizza, which is also delicious, and this is what I'm gonna have for dinner tonight. I'll see you next time on Tasting History. That's pizza. That's pizza.
Yeah, I don't think I would have called that pizza either. That's just not pizza, though. That's just like bread. Feeding the Knights Templar. Breakfast on the Titanic. The original PB&J. Pemmican, History's Power Bar. Food of the Pharaoh. Bread in a can. Oh, the Great Molasses Flood. Oh. I've heard about this. No, feck off. You don't get ad time here. Go away.
A wave crashed through Boston's North End, leaving a trail of death and destruction in its wake. Though it wasn't a wave of water, but molasses, a popular sweetener at the time and one of the main ingredients in Boston's famous brown bread. So thank you to NordVPN for sponsoring this video as we take a look at the Great Boston Molasses Flood and make some bread in a can. This time on Tasting History.
It's like that one episode of SpongeBob. Canned bread.
So when deciding on a recipe for today, I knew I was wading into troubled waters, or troubled molasses as it were, because every Bostonian thinks that their version of brown bread is the version of brown bread. And it seems that this is not a new phenomenon because looking through Boston's cookbooks over the past 130 years, it seems every author kind of scoffed at everyone else's version of brown bread, even though they're all incredibly similar. But I figured the safest course would be to consult that most wicked iconic Boston recipe collection, Fannie Farmer's 1896 Boston Cooking School Cookbook, whose recipe for brown bread calls for 1 cup or 120 grams of rye meal, 1 cup or 140 grams of graham flour, Graham flour is a type of very coarsely ground wheat flour, and it is named after Sylvester Graham, who lives on in the graham cracker. And it's kind of hard to find graham flour today. You can get it online, but if you can't find any, you can just use stone ground wheat flour. You're not going to notice the difference once everything is together. 1 cup or 160 grams of cornmeal. Mind you, that is not corn flour, which is sometimes used today, but cornmeal, which is, like the people of Boston, grittier. 3/4 teaspoon of baking soda, and I can tell you right now that is a lot less than is used in modern recipes, so if you want to double it, if you want something a little bit fluffier, go ahead, but I'm going to stick with what she asks for. 1 teaspoon of salt, 3/4 cup or 180 grams of molasses, 2 cups or 475 milliliters of buttermilk. Now, Ms. Fanny Farmer did prefer her brown bread plain, but a lot of people add walnuts or sometimes raisins or currants, so you can add those, and that is what I, Max Miller, would do if I were not following her recipe. And I mention my name, Max Miller, because it seems that a lot of people who watch this show don't actually know my name. I'm often getting Matt and Mark and Marcus, which seems way off, and today I even got a Max Kellerman, which, okay. But it is Max Miller, which is why I really appreciate today's sponsor, NordVPN, giving me the unique link, nordvpn.com/Max Miller. But more importantly, is in seeing where they got the information, just making sure I'm getting my facts right. But NordVPN will allow me to switch my IP action. So when you are logged in, Minx, so I only use it for research. An extra month plus my name. Now on to the brown bread.
All right, back to the video.
She says to mix and sift dry ingredients, add molasses and milk, stir until well mixed, turn into a well buttered mold, and steam 3 1/2 hours. The cover should be buttered before being placed on mold and then tied down with string. Otherwise, the bread in rising might force off cover. Mold should never be filled more than 2/3 full. A melon mold or 1-pound baking powder boxes make the most attractive shaped loaves, but a 5-pound lard pail answers the purpose. So it's that last part that I find most intriguing, all the different kinds of molds that she mentions. She talks about a melon mold, which was very popular in her day and was a large mold in the shape of a melon, usually a muskmelon or something that kind of has a ribbing going down the sides. Then she says you could also use a 5-pound lard pail, which is a paint bucket full of pig fat. But she also mentions using a 1-pound baking powder box, which, based on what I could find, looked very similar to the cans that baking powder is often sold in now, but quite a bit larger. And this seems to be the preferred shape of brown bread throughout the years, though usually it was a coffee can, and in my case, cans that were holding pinto beans until yesterday. So get yourself a can or two and then butter them up nice and good, and then prepare your batter. First, sift all 3 flours and then whisk them together with the salt and the baking soda, and then pour in the molasses and the buttermilk and stir everything together until you have a batter. Now immediately the baking soda and the buttermilk will start to react with each other, creating tiny bubbles. That is what is going to give the bread some rise, and as she is using about half as much baking soda as a modern recipe, you don't want to waste any of them bubbles. So get to work right away pouring your batter into the buttered can or cans, and she says to not fill them more than 2/3 of the way full at most, so err on the side of less full than more. Then smooth the top of the batter and put the lid on. And if you're using something that doesn't have a lid, that's okay. You can just use aluminum foil, and I'm actually going to put an extra layer of aluminum foil on mine and then tie a string tightly around it and then kind of crimp the edges. You just don't want any liquid to get inside of the can itself. Then set the can onto a trivet in lightly boiling water and put the lid on and let it steam for 3 1/2 hours. Now, as I'm splitting mine between 2 cans, it'll probably be done in closer to 2 or 2 1/2 hours. But I'm going to let it go for the whole time because the nice thing with this bread is you really can't over steam it. Now some recipes today actually have you add some sugar into the recipe to satisfy that modern sweet tooth. But in 1919, the only sweetener most people could afford was molasses because sugar had been rationed for the past few years on account of the war. And so it's fitting that molasses is used in this recipe as it is in so many of Boston's iconic recipes like Boston baked beans. But the molasses that was about to flood the city of Boston was not destined for kitchens, but rather munitions factories.
Welcome to the PetSmart kitchen. I'm excited
Nope, go away. Go away. You get no ad time here. Back off. Alright, here's the history portion.
Distilling molasses produces ethanol, which at the time was used in two things, rum and explosives, both of which were big business for the Purity Distilling Company of Boston. And in 1915, a couple years before the US entered World War I, they decided to build a massive holding tank right in the city's densely populated north end to store shipments of molasses before sending it on to their refinery in East Cambridge. The massive tank dwarfed everything in the surrounding neighborhood and was set only feet away from the main road. 90 feet wide and 50 feet tall, its shadow loomed over the mostly immigrant residents and businesses near the wharf. It was built to hold 2.5 million gallons of molasses, though actually it was built to be that size, but it clearly wasn't built to actually hold that much molasses. See, when they ordered the tank to be built, they put construction under the guidance of Arthur Gell, a top engineer with an impeccable safety record. No, I'm just kidding. He was a financial advisor who had never built anything in his life and had absolutely zero engineering experience and just wanted to get the job done as quickly and as cheaply as possible. But how could this be, you ask? Was there no oversight, no regulation? Well, not really. There wasn't a lot of regulation in building at the time, and if there was regulation, it was consigned to buildings. But this was not a building, this was a structure. And so they didn't even need a permit to put it up. So with no inspections expected, they didn't need to hire a competent builder when they could just get someone who they know would bring in the project on time and under budget. And Gell did just that. Though even then it wasn't easy because the deadline to have the tank finished was, like my lower back, tight and inflexible, because even before the tank was finished, the company had ordered a massive shipment of molasses to be delivered. But with a few corners cut, Gell had that project finished just as the molasses steamed into Boston Harbor. But as it happened, one of those corners that was cut was that of safety testing. So instead of filling it up with 50 feet of water to make sure it didn't leak, they filled it up with 6 inches of water and then gave the go-ahead. They figured if it didn't leak with 6 inches of water, why would it leak with 50 feet of molasses? Makes sense. But when 700,000 gallons were offloaded into the tank, it leaked a lot. Molasses began to ooze out of the places where the metal was riveted together, so much so that children would routinely collect the leaking molasses to bring home to their mothers, who no doubt were making brown bread. Now, as convenient as the leaking molasses was to the bakers of the North End, it was a little bit of an embarrassment to the Purity Distilling Company. So they emptied the tank, hired a competent engineer, and went to work at once to fix all of the leaks inside and out. No, I'm just kidding. They found some paint that was the exact color of the molasses that was leaking, and they painted the entire tank the same color so that nobody could see the leaks.
Nobody's gonna know. They're gonna know.
What they couldn't paint over were the moaning and creaking sounds that the tank made whenever it became close to full with hot, viscous molasses. Though in January of 1919, the molasses was not hot, but rather quite cold, as temperatures had hovered around 0 for weeks. But on Wednesday, January 15th, the temperature in the city rose sharply overnight, reaching a balmy 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, what happened that day is all theory, and frankly, it could be a combination of different factors. One being that the steel at that low temperature could become quite brittle, something that the Titanic learned when it was in cold water. On top of that, a shipment of 600,000 gallons of molasses had recently been offloaded, and to make it less viscous and so easier to move, they heated the molasses. And when the heated molasses came into contact with the cold molasses, it began to ferment, causing carbon dioxide to release and pressure in the tank to build up. Then at 12:30 p.m. on January 15th, 1919, the first rivet shot out of the side of the tank, followed by another, and then another. After the first 2 or 3 rivets gave way, the others began giving way rapidly, resembling the barking of a rapid-fire machine gun. This was followed by a low rumbling sound as the tank of molasses burst. Persons walking along Commercial Street were picked up by a rush of air and hurled many feet. An auto truck was picked up by the force of the air current, hurled several feet, and dropped at the opposite curbing, a mass of twisted wreckage.
Welcome to Maison Perrier.
Nope, go away. God damn these ads. How much is YouTube Premium? Who knows? How much is YouTube Premium? Someone tell me, please. Oh, wait, I forgot to unmute.
Through the streets at 35 miles an hour with such force that it knocked buildings off of their foundations and caused them to collapse.
Excuse me.
The tsunami carried cars, horses, people, and other debris for blocks. The wave smashed a 1-ton piece of steel into the trestle of the elevated train where, miraculously, a train had passed over only seconds before it collapsed. Men, women, and children were swamped by the wave and drowned in the molasses as it began to thicken in the cold air. Molasses, waist-deep, covered the street and swirled and bubbled about the wreckage. Here and there struggled to form. Whether it was animal or human being was impossible to tell. Only an upheaval, a thrashing about in the sticky mass showed where any life was. Horses died like so many flies on sticky fly paper. The more they struggled, the deeper in the mess they were ensnared. Human beings, men and women, suffered likewise. As it cooled, the molasses thickened, clogging people's noses and mouths so that most who died did so from suffocation. And when taken to hospitals, identifying them was nearly impossible through their syrupy cocoons. People came from all over to help those that were stuck in the molasses, but would often end up getting stuck in the quagmire themselves. Though many firefighters, Red Cross nurses, and sailors from nearby ships tried their best to pull people out, sometimes successfully and sometimes not. We saw this big cloud of brown dust and dirt and a slight noise, and there was an arm sticking out from underneath the wheel of a truck. So 2 of us got a hold of his arm and pulled, and unfortunately, we pulled his arm off. I did not see that coming. In total, 21 people died and 150 were seriously injured, and the cleanup took 6 long months. Those cleaning would often track molasses all over the city so that all of Boston ended up being just a little sticky. In the end, they used sand and fire hoses to push most of the molasses into Boston Harbor, sweetening any tea left over from the Boston Tea Party, I would think. But much of the molasses seemed uncleanable because even decades after the disaster, on warm days, Boston's North End would still smell of molasses.
Damn.
Now, it didn't take long before the finger-pointing began, and U.S. Industrial Alcohol, who had recently purchased the Purity Distilling Company, clung to the idea that it had been sabotage and not gross neglect that caused the disaster. But after years of litigation, it was determined that, as anyone who lived in the area knew, it had just been a shoddily made tank that was destined to collapse.
Michael, hello, welcome. Yes, I'll hydrate. I got some coffee. Today, we're doing back from a very short day of work. Why so short? What happened? What did you not much business today or what? But yeah, today we're doing food history. This one is about Boston brown bread as well as the Great Molasses Flood. Yeah, shoddy engineering and cost-cutting corners and all that. Move? Christmas decorations? Oh no, it's starting. It's already starting. Mariah Carey is unthawing from her block of ice. But yeah. I've heard about this, but I never, known much of the details about the Great Molasses Flood.
In the end, U.S. Industrial Alcohol paid between $500,000 and $1 million to the city and to the families of the victims, which, even accounting for inflation, doesn't seem like that much, but the fact that they were held financially responsible at all was a huge step forward at that time. It also led to new building regulations and zoning laws that would prevent you from putting up a giant industrial building right next to people's houses. Now, something I found really interesting was that in the newspapers from the days after the disaster, right next to the articles about this Boston molasses flood, there are articles about another looming disaster. Because only 2 days after the tank burst, Nebraska cast the deciding vote to ratify the 18th Amendment, ushering in the era of Prohibition. So with no more rum being produced and fewer munitions being necessary now that World War I was over, molasses was really only good for one thing: making Boston brown bread. So once your bread has been thoroughly steamed, you can take it out of the pot. And I find that these canning tongs are very helpful in this situation, and they're just so cool. It's like the claw. So I'll put a link in the description to where you can get these. Then open the can and let the bread cool for 20 minutes before removing the loaf. It should slide right out, and then slice and serve with a bit of salted butter. And here we are, Fannie Farmer's Boston brown bread. So some old recipes actually have you put the loaf in the oven for a few minutes to like make a crust around it, but Fannie Farmer does not, so I am not. So I'm just gonna eat it as she says. It smells so good. The rye is actually what comes through almost as much as the molasses. I don't know, let's give it a try. So I can see why people add sugar today, because I had expected it to be sweet. I've never had it. It's not sweet. I mean, there's like that hint of sweetness that you get from molasses, but there's also that bitterness from molasses. But really what you're getting is the rye. That's the flavor that is coming through, and it's just like tempered by the molasses. But then you get a little bit of like that cornbread too from the corn. Also the texture. The texture is what makes this so special. It's soft and spongy and moist and yet pretty dense. Again, she uses a lot less baking soda. In fact, I would not only use more baking soda, but I would also throw in a little bit of baking powder, because with the very long cook time, the baking soda is going to get used up at the beginning, whereas the baking powder will kind of last a little bit longer. Now, if for some reason you don't want to make this, which you should, but if for some reason you don't want to, you can actually buy brown bread in a can. But I encourage you to make it as Fannie Farmer did, or one of the more modern recipes, that's fine too. Like I said, they're all very, very similar. Make sure to follow me over on Instagram, Tasting History with Max Miller, and I'll see you next time on Tasting History. I'm going to eat this bread because it's really, really delicious, and I think it's going to just grow on me even more.
Tasting History with Max Miller. Oh yeah, you missed it, but there was a thing called election cake. Apparently that used to be a thing, like back in colonial times. Like they would vote, like I think it was Connecticut, they would vote for the governor, and they also had like a big old election day party. Everyone made cake. Yep, that was the thing. Oh yeah. This 500-year-old pizza, quote unquote, that really wasn't pizza. Alright, this is the one we just watched, the Great Molasses Flood and Boston Brown Bread. Oh yeah, the history of potato chips. Viking blood bread. School lunch from the Great Depression. Oregon Trail breakfast. Oh, airline food from like the... Oh, yeah, I want to see this. Definitely, definitely. You get no ad time here. Go away. Just waiting for the skip button.
You're lucky to get a bag of pretzels and a ginger ale. But back in the golden age of air travel, the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, pretty much every ticket came with a luxurious meal. Meals like this one from United Airlines in 1954, which includes pot roast, Delmonico potatoes, and a heavenly delight salad. So thank you to Trade Coffee for sponsoring this video as we fly the friendly skies. This time on Tasting History. So based on the age of most of my audience, I'm going to guess that you didn't get to fly during the golden age of air travel.
No,
Neither
I
did
did not.
I'm not quite that old, but I did get to be around for some of the vestiges of the golden age, like getting to go into the cockpit as a kid and have the wings put on me by the pilot himself. But when it came to food, I wasn't around for any of the good stuff. It was always just peanuts and Coke. And frankly, it's probably a good thing because the quality of airline food when I was a kid was not great. But that was not always the case, because like in the 1950s and 60s, airlines prided themselves on
oh wait, hang on, let me double check that. Oh yeah, that. Yeah, I see it. And yeah, do what you need to in regards to that. I think I got like a message from them on Twitch as well. But yeah, do what you need to.
the quality of food that they were serving. That's because during the time, prices of tickets were regulated, so they couldn't compete on price, so they had to compete in other ways. Basically, how to make the flight actually more pleasant for the passengers, and one big thing was food. And today I can actually travel back in time and try some of that luxurious food with this. This is a cookbook that was put out in 1954 by United Airlines. It's called Favorite Recipes of Mainliner Chefs. And today I've chosen 3 dishes from this book so I can create an entire meal that would have been served on an airplane in 1954. First is a beef pot roast by Chef Emile Saltzman from the New York Flight Kitchen, then the Delmonico potatoes by Chef Marc Grugier of the Honolulu Kitchen, and finally the Heavenly Delight salad by Chef Edward Gerber of the Washington, D.C. Flight Kitchen. And the Flight Kitchen is where they would actually prepare the food before they would put it on the plane just before takeoff. Now, the second 2 recipes are pretty simple, but the first recipe has a lot of ingredients. So for the pot roast, what you're going to need is 2.5 pounds of beef chuck or round, 1 pound of veal bones. Finding veal bones is quite the struggle, so just use beef bones. 2 cups of beef stock, 2 medium onions quartered, 6 ounces of tomato paste, 2 bay leaves, 1 sprig of parsley, 1 cup of diced carrots, a ½ cup diced celery, 6 whole cloves, 10 whole peppercorns, 2 teaspoons of minced garlic, 2 tablespoons of butter or other fat, 1 cup of dry red wine, and then some flour and salt and pepper to taste. And as always, I'm going to have these recipes all up on the Tasting History website with metrics so you can follow along at home. So first, Chef Emile has you season the meat with plenty of salt and pepper and then dredge it in flour. Then melt the butter in a large pot and then add the meat and the marrow bones and let the meat sear for several minutes on one side and then flip it over and let it get some color on the other. Once it's lightly browned all over, add in the onions, celery, carrots, parsley, whole cloves, bay leaves, and peppercorns and let it cook for about 15 minutes. Then add the garlic, stock, tomato paste, and the wine, and then stir everything together and let it come to a simmer. Then put the lid on and let it cook at a simmer for about 2 hours or until the meat is just falling apart. And during that time, you can make yourself up a cup of coffee from today's sponsor, Trade. Now, on an airline, the coffee is never really good. And partly that's because our sense of taste is all wonky up there. We'll get into that later. But also, the water tends to be really low quality, and frankly, the coffee is also often low quality as well. That last part, at least, can be rectified by getting your coffee with Trade. Trade is a coffee delivery service that delivers coffee curated to your taste right. And they have hundreds of different roasts, so there is really something for everyone. And right now, when you sign up using my link, drinks are actually invented for the airlines or by someone working for the airlines. It was invented in 1943 for passengers of a flying boat at Foynes Air Base in Ireland. Supposedly, a bunch of disgruntled passengers got off a plane, so the chef there just took some coffee and put some whiskey in it to calm everybody down, and there we have the Irish coffee. And you can drink some coffee, Irish or otherwise, while you make your Delmonico potatoes. For that, you'll need 8 medium potatoes, peeled and chopped, a half cup chopped pimentos, 2 cups half and half, and then some salt and pepper and plenty of Parmesan cheese to cover the top. So first mix the potatoes with the pimentos and then add a teaspoon and a half of salt and a teaspoon of pepper to the half and half and set it on the stove to heat up just until it simmers. Then pour all of that over the potatoes, making sure the potatoes are covered, and then set the dish in the oven at 375 degrees Fahrenheit, 190 Celsius for about an hour and a half or until the potatoes are totally cooked through. Then take it out of the oven, up the oven to 400 degrees, sprinkle a bunch of Parmesan cheese to cover the top, and return it to the oven for 5 more minutes or until the top is melted and lightly browned. Now before we make our Heavenly Delight salad, which really stretches the definition of a salad, make sure you subscribe to Tasting History, hit that like button, it really helps the channel.
Like and subscribe,
let's talk
everyone.
about the history of airline food.
Hey, it's me, your skin. I crave being clear.
Yeah, I already used this stuff. Go away. Alright, here's the history part of food history.
So before we get into the history, I want to mention this wonderful resource that I used called Food in the Air and Space by Richard Foss. It's a wonderful deep dive into the history of food in the air, not just airlines, but in space, and even he goes all the way back to the 18th century with hot air balloons. It's fantastic.
Hot air balloon
check it out
food?
if you are interested in this topic. I am not going all the way back to the 18th century. I am starting just after World War I in 19...
Something I noticed. In the last video, he had a different Pokemon plush on the stand over here. Just a little detail.
1919.
Wait, he has a book?
On October 11th, the first meal on a commercial airline was served during a Handley Page flight from Paris to London. This was a prepackaged lunchbox with a sandwich and a piece of fruit, and just like Spirit Airlines today, food was not included in the price of the ticket, so you had to shell out 3 shillings for this cold lunch. And pretty much for the next decade, all meals on planes were cold. Like the Western Air Express meals on flights between Los Angeles and San Francisco, where cold fried chicken, potato salad, and sandwiches were catered by the Los Angeles-based Pig and Whistle, which sadly only closed a couple years ago. The same year that they were serving cold fried chicken, 1928...
Yep, I can see it right here. Tasting History, Max Miller. He has his own book.
Lufthansa upped the ante with the first hot in-flight meal on flights from Berlin to Paris, where the food was made on the ground and then kept warm in insulated containers. This began airlines' increasing desire to provide passengers with the best and most cutting-edge cuisine available. The issue was keeping it warm because, especially on a longer flight, those insulated containers just didn't really cut it. And so if you wanted to heat the food up on the plane, you had to have an oven built on the plane, and most planes just weren't that big. But the flying boats of the 1930s were. And Pan American Airlines, Pan Am, installed galleys on many of their clippers so they could not only reheat the food, but actually cook it. They even had a dedicated dining room aboard with tables and white tablecloths, so it was more like eating in an actual restaurant. United Airlines soon followed suit and began installing kitchens on their planes where they would serve not cold but hot fried chicken as well as freshly scrambled eggs. This is also around the time when United Airlines really began priding themselves on the quality of their food. By the way, this is not sponsored by United Airlines, just talk about history. Maybe it would have been nice if they had sponsored it, though once I get to the part about flight attendants, stewardesses, and how they train them, they'd probably revoke that sponsorship. We'll get to that. Anyway, United made a huge leap forward in the quality of airline food in 1936 when in Oakland, California, they opened up their first flight kitchen. They hired top chefs to design a menu worthy of a wonderful luxury restaurant on the ground, but with the idea that these dishes could be served in the air. Far more elaborate dishes could be made this way by preparing them on the ground rather than in the air, and that is what they called their mainliner cuisine, and that is actually what we're cooking from today. It's those dishes that they created. Other airlines quickly followed suit, and menus from this time period really show how fancy airline food could get. Mignon of veal with Russian sauce, Boston cream pie, or an entire Irish-themed meal on St. Patrick's Day 1940 with a Dublin-style Lego lamb stew. European airlines were going extra fine dining by serving everything from lobster to foie gras to peach melba. Now, the next big technological leap came, as many technological leaps do, from a military contract. During World War II, William Maxon, or rather his company, developed several inventions for the US military. In addition to the Maxon multiple gun mount, which airlines never seem to have adopted, his company developed the Maxon Whirlwind Oven, which by circulating the air in the oven would heat things more evenly and much quicker. This was essentially the first convection oven, and it was designed to fit these meals called Maxon sky plates, which were served on airplanes for the Navy and the Army during the war and afterward. Then after the war, Pan American Airlines took these ovens and installed them on many of their commercial planes so that they could get rid of the full kitchen or have the food that was being brought on heated at a much quicker pace. It was also during the war that several airlines hired their first all-female flight attendant crews. Now, there had been female flight attendants, or stewardesses as they were called, since 1930. But during the war, the lack of men saw the female stewardess become the standard for quite some time. In fact, in subsequent decades, many airlines refused to hire men for the job at all. And they started using the female stewardesses as a selling point to their clientele, who were mostly men, basically saying, hey, you want your food and drink served by a pretty lady. Now, this meant that stewardesses really had to become the ultimate service provider. Back in the 30s and even the early 40s, you actually had to be a registered nurse to become a flight attendant. But by the 50s, the airlines were doing all of that training themselves. As can be seen in this one ad from United Airlines, told you we'd get back to this, where they boast. 2 months ago, Sherry Woodruff couldn't even balance a cup of coffee. She was friendly, intelligent, and attractive, and wanted more than anything else to be a great stewardess. But then she had 5.5 weeks at United Stewardesses School. We taught Sherry how to serve a gourmet dinner, how to soothe a first flyer, how to apply everything from makeup to first aid. Today she can warm a baby's formula with one hand and pour 4 cups of coffee with the other. They actually use these ads to entice young women to apply to learn the skills not of a great stewardess, but of a great housewife. They even went so far as to imply that on one of the flights is the best place for you to secure a husband, as can be seen in this 1967 ad. Old maid, that's what the other United Airlines stewardesses call her, because she's been flying for almost 3 years now. The average tenure of a United stewardess is only 21 months before she gets married. Maybe that's why more people fly United than any other airline. Everyone gets warmth, friendliness, and extra care, and someone may get a wife.
Wow.
Of course, as soon as they did get married,
my
United
God.
would fire them, and that wasn't deemed illegal until 1971. They also had a mandatory retirement age of 30. Now, during the 50s and 60s,
30?
the airlines would actually
Jesus.
use the stewardesses and the cuisine in tandem to sell passengers on their flights,
That's
especially
messed
with
up,
something
though.
they called themed flights. Like TWA had foreign accent flights. These were themed Italian, French, Old English, and Manhattan Penthouse. The flight attendants wore costumes. Like the English flight, they would wear like a wench costume, and then they would also play music from whatever country it was, and of course, the cuisine was from the country as well. Northwest Airlines really doubled down on these theme flights with something called the Fujiyama Room. On October 30th, 1955, they debuted these rooms featuring kitschy Asian decor on a number of planes, and they would serve food like shrimp, cheese, and fruit out of a pineapple with little umbrellas sticking out of it. It was sort of like Japan and tiki culture mashed up, thereby ruining both.
Welcome to the PetSmart kitchen.
Go away. You get no ad time here. Fuck off.
Eastern Airlines' Hunt breakfast flights from 1957. This
How
was
much is
styled in the
YouTube
tradition
Premium?
of
Do
an
you
Old
know,
English
Michael?
hunt breakfast, basically having breakfast out while you're hunting. And so all the food was themed that way too, but when it came to the sounds, it would
Future wife might be a stewardess. I don't know, dude. I'm pretty sure trying to hit on someone during a flight isn't the best idea. Odds are you'll likely never see them again.
would be barking dogs and bugles. Now, perhaps no flight married the idea of the pretty stewardess and the quality cuisine better than United Airlines executive flight, something I'm sure the company would like to forget. These flew from 1953 to 1970 and were men only. Women were not allowed to purchase a ticket on these flights. Aimed at the executive businessmen of New York and Chicago, these flights would take off every day at 5 p.m., flying between the two cities. And there's an ad from the time that lets you know exactly what you can expect. United Airlines invites you to fly the Chicago Executive, a club in the sky for men only. You'll enjoy the informal club-like atmosphere, smoke your pipe or cigar if you wish, and make yourself more comfortable by using the pair of slippers provided. Enjoy congenial company in the lounge. A full-course steak dinner is table served by the two stewardesses aboard. It's a delicious meal prepared by the experienced continental chefs. Now, it wasn't just these themed flights, but really all flights of the 1950s and 60s that tried to up their game when it came not just to food, but just luxury in general. The seats became cushier than ever, often fully reclining, or on some longer flights, there would be an entire berth with a lay-down bed like you'd expect on a train or on one of the really top luxury airlines of today. And this is when the food really became a spectacle. There was a TWA flight where they would roll a trolley down the aisle with a whole piece of roast beef where they would slice it off and you'd be served roast beef au jus right there from the aisle. Other trolleys would include chilled seafood like lobster and crab legs. There were fresh fruit trays, salads and charcuterie, and even a dessert cart where they would make a sundae right in front of you. Bring that back. I'm starting a petition. Now, one of the most splendid setups for food actually came from Scandinavian Airlines, where they offered the Scandinavian country-style buffet during the late 60s, where they would carve a ham right there in the aisle. Now, while the food was getting more splendid, that doesn't actually mean it was getting better, because the flavor of the food wasn't exactly what it was on the ground. First of all, if it was made on the ground and then kept on the plane and then having to be reheated, you're essentially eating really fancy leftovers. But another big thing was that we don't taste the same when we're up in an airplane. Partly it's because the real lack of humidity messes with our sense of smell and hence our sense of taste. So you're not tasting the food as much as you would on the ground. So they started adding a lot more salt and sugar to their recipes to compensate. But while that may have helped with the flavor of the food, there was something else coming along in airline travel that would really screw up the service, and that was the adoption of jets. Airlines began switching over to jets, which went much faster than the earlier airplanes, and this meant that the 7-course meal often served even on domestic flights was becoming a thing of the past, at least in economy. Sometimes in first class now, I guess you get it, but even so, everything had to be sped up. The shorter service time also led to most airplanes swapping out glassware and china for plastic trays and plastic forks, because unlike the china, you didn't have to clean it right then and kind of stack it nicely, which took a lot of time, but rather you could just toss it in a bin and deal with it when you landed. Though this was published in 1954, and they're already eating off of plastic, so, you know, it was a gradual change. And all of these changes going on gave airline food a new reputation of being rubbery and bland. There's actually a wonderful musical from 1965 called Do I Hear a Waltz? And there's a whole song about the travails of airline travel at the time, and there's part that is all about the food. The shiny stuff is tomatoes, the salad lies in a group. The curly stuff is potatoes, the stuff that moves is soup. Anything that is white is sweet, anything that is brown is meat, anything that is gray, don't eat. And, you know, that was kind of the reputation for the next few decades. Of course, this change in the quality of the cuisine really only affected the economy class or coach class. And nothing exemplifies this kind of divide between coach and first class at the time better than the Great Sandwich War. See, it was 1958, and the International Air Transport Association, who made sure that all planes around the world were following the same rules, decided to allow for the first economy tickets to be purchased in transatlantic flights. But because they were going to be less expensive than the average ticket, they had to take stuff away, and this meant that nobody got any food any hot food who purchased this. All they could get was a sandwich. But there was Pan Am, an American airline, who said that a sandwich was some meat with bread. And then there were the European sandwiches, and they went all out. You'd get 5 slices of ox tongue, a lettuce heart, asparagus, and sliced carrots on a slice of bread.
Or
5 slices of liver pate, fried crisp bacon, mushrooms, and sliced tomato on a slice of bread. Basically, it was a whole meal on a slice of bread, so it was a sandwich. And Pan Am was like, well, they're using that to their advantage. We're supposed to be on an even playing field, so the association had to come up with a definition of a sandwich. A sandwich must be cold, largely of bread or something similar, unadorned, self-contained, and must not include such fillings as caviar, oysters, or lobster. Basically, give the economy class passengers the meagerest food that you can possibly find, a theme which is still with us today. But should you have been able to afford a first-class fare, then the great meals would have continued. And should you have gobs of money available to you, then starting in 1969, you could book passage on the Concorde. The Concorde flew between cities in Western Europe and the East Coast of the US and did so at twice the speed of sound, which would get you to your destination in just 3.5 hours. Now, these were flown mostly by British Airways and Air France, and the cost of a ticket, depending on the time, could cost as much as 30 times the average price of an economy ticket. But for that, you got there a lot faster, and you got quite the meal. What followed the coffee was a breakfast of fresh papaya, guava, pineapple, strawberries, and mangoes, croissants and brioche that might have come from a Paris bakery, a pretty good approximation of eggs Benedict, and a soufflé Gruyère, all washed down with Piper Heidsieck Cuvée Diplomatique. The china, of course, was Limoges. What really ended the splendid food of airlines, as well as the golden age of air travel itself, was the age of deregulation, which started in 1978. Airfare had been regulated for decades, making it so that the only way the airlines had to compete was through perks like wonderful food and their flight attendants or stewardesses, leg room, the comfort, entertainment, or those flights where they had dogs and bugles playing throughout the cabin, that hunt breakfast. I wouldn't like that.
A wider
Nope, back off, go away. Go away, I said.
The deregulation, they could start to do price wars, and this was good and bad. The good part was that it dramatically lowered the price of airfare. For instance, this TWA list of flights from 1955 shows that a flight from Boston to Los Angeles cost $106. That's about $1,200 in today's money. Also, since planes were a lot slower at the time and had to make multiple stops, that flight took 12 hours. No thanks. But these price drops made it so a lot more people had flying available to them. But that also meant that the quality of the flight would, of course, go down. More seats in planes were required to make up for lower fares, which meant a far less comfortable flight, and there were also fewer options for food, and on many flights, no food at all. This is when Southwest distinguished themselves as the peanut airline. And for most of my childhood, I recall fondly my dad coming back from business trips, always on Southwest Airlines it feels like, and he'd have his pockets just filled with these little bags of peanuts, or if I was lucky, the honey roasted peanuts, and that was wonderful. Now, the early 80s saw the golden age of air travel, especially in economy class, come to an end. Many business and first-class flights still go to great lengths to offer quality food, often getting top chefs to prepare menus for the airline. But for me, I don't really mind. I'd rather pay less and get, a stupidly expensive sandwich at the airport and just bring it on with me. The one food you should never bring on an airplane is French fries. I never do that. It just smells up the whole cabin. Don't do that. Though, you could bring on this pot roast because it is also smelling up the cabin, my house, but it smells really, really good. So as soon as the pot roast is cooked through, take it out and
I
simmer
completely
down the
forgot
liquid to
about this for a second.
And then strain it out and save the onions and other vegetables back to serve with the roast itself. And now to prepare a very quick dessert or salad, because even though this is absolutely a dessert, it's actually in the salad section of the book. You'll need 4 tart apples cut into small pieces, then add 32 mini marshmallows and cut 8 maraschino cherries in quarters and mix those all together with the marshmallows and the apples. I'm also making a half portion because this is still going to make a lot of Heavenly Delight salad. In a separate bowl, whip a cup of heavy cream into whipped cream and then add a teaspoon of lemon juice, a teaspoon and a half of mayonnaise, and a teaspoon and a half of honey. Mix it all together, then mix it with the apples, and it's ready to go. And here we are, a full meal worthy of a United Airlines flight from the golden age of air travel. I just have to show you this tray. I put the cups over there, but how cool is this? It's actually not from the 50s. It's from the, I believe the early 60s. I think they said it was about 1963 or 4. But I just thought it was so cool. It's an actual tray from the time. It even has like little salt and peppers. And of course, plasticware. So I'm gonna try to eat a pot roast with this. Let's give it a try. All right, even after like 60 years, the knife is pretty good.
Wait, it's legit 60-year-old like tray and cutlery?
I knew it would be amazing because it smelled so good. It is so tender, it just falls apart. I really, really like the addition of kind of adding in the onions and the other things that we're cooking on top of it. Unless you get like a bay leaf.
Oh, hydrate. All right.
It's so flavorful, and I will be eating the whole thing over the next couple days. Now let's try the potatoes. So I think that I made a mistake and maybe didn't chop them as fine as I should have. I mean, the flavor's great. It's cream and potatoes and Parmesan cheese. What's not to like? I just think that if I had diced them a little finer, the texture would be a little bit better, or at least they'd be a bit better coated with the cream mixture. Honestly, even doing these as mashed potatoes, I think that's how I'd prefer them. And finally, on to our salad dessert. And
salad, quote unquote.
Get a little bit of everything, a little apple, little cherry. It's not as sweet as I expected. Now, the original recipe says you could actually add sugar. I wouldn't. These are tart apples, but it's not tart. It has a little zing from the apples and from the lemon juice, but it's plenty sweet. It doesn't need to be any sweeter because, I mean, there's plenty of sweet stuff in there. But it reminds me of ambrosia, kind of. If you've ever had ambrosia, my Nana would once in a while make that for Easter. It's fun. It's delicious. I wouldn't call it a salad. It is definitely a dessert, but you know. So I gotta say, all 3 dishes, really good. I would make all 3 again. I'd probably mash the potatoes, but that's the only change I would make. That pot roast is definitely going on in my repertoire of weekly or probably monthly dishes to make. And I will see you next time on Tasting History.
Remember to like and subscribe, everyone. Honestly, though, the last time I went on a flight, like, the food wasn't bad. I think I had pics of it. If I scroll back far enough in Discord, I probably find the pics I posted of the airline food. But yeah. I believe that's gonna be all from me for today. Gotta start getting ready for the day, unfortunately. But yeah. Yeah, thanks for being here, everyone. Hope you all had fun. I know I did. Too poor to enjoy fancy plane jet. Well, I was in economy. It's not exactly fancy here, dude. It's like the reason economy exists is so that you're more tempted to buy like a better like seat next time. Yeah, the whole point of economy is to show you how miserable it is, so that you want to buy a better ticket next time around. All right. Let's see who's on so I can go raid. I'm just gonna have a quick look around. Let's go say hi to Riona, I guess. Right after I sit through 40 seconds of ad, which is bullshit. Okie doke, let's get that raid ready. Raid channel. Alright, but yeah, thanks once again for being here. Remember to hydrate, rest up, eat tasty things, all that good jazz. And, peace out.